In this video, I'm going to be building two rolling workbenches or work tables. In one table, I'll be using it to store some bulky tools and other items, and it'll also double as an assembly table. And with the other table, I'll be using it as a sit-down lathe table, and a joiner table, and an assembly table, and just for some other basic storage. The truth is, you can use these tables for pretty much anything you want. There's a ton of storage, and I designed them to be tucked away underneath my main workbench table so that it saves a ton of space in the shop. Before I started, I already prepared a design in SketchUp. Here's the rolling tables pulled out. Here's the rolling tables opened up. And I created a parts list that had all of the different boards and dimensions that I needed to cut. As you can see, I'm having to manually measure, mark, and then cut each individual board, which takes a long time and is kind of a pain. Not to mention, it also introduces some inaccuracies if I mark something on the tape measure slightly different than the previous cut. So what I plan to do is take the radial arm saw fence and then extend that onto my extension tables and add production stops so that I only have to measure a board once, and then I can accurately reproduce that same cut across as many boards as I need to. So I plan on doing that in a future video, so make sure to keep an eye out for that. The next step was to cut arches in all of the tabletop supports. This allows for a greater tool capacity and allows me to slide larger tools in from the side without hitting the cross braces. I left a thickness of 1 inch at the top of each arch, which allows each brace to remain very strong. After I got the first one cut, I used that one as a template so that I can mark and then cut all of the other braces. Now we need to cut out the notches that support the shelves. So let me hide a couple of these boards so you can see what I mean. So go ahead and hide that. And I'll hide these. And as you can see, we have a notch here, and we have another one at the top. And there's another one that you can't see at the bottom unless I hide those other components. So we're going to go ahead and cut those out. I'll be cutting these out on my radial arm saw, but I've seen people cut these out on just a standard circular saw, or you can use your table saw. It really doesn't matter. In my case, it's just a lot easier to use my radial arm saw. Now, if you look at the supports that hold the lid in place, or the tabletop, you'll see that there's this diagonal line that goes from the top and tapers down to the corner. And we basically need to cut that corner off, otherwise when we go to close the lid, it's going to catch on that corner, and then the lid isn't going to close all the way. So we basically need to cut that back a 1/4 inch on the top, and then taper that cut down to the corner. So the next step was to flip everything over and install the casters. And the washers that I had to install the casters were a little on the large side. So instead of going to the store and freezing my butt off to buy some new washers, I ended up just taking the washers that I had and I clipped off the sides so that the washers would still tuck in and fit nicely underneath the table. And It's not ideal, but it got the job done. My wife helped me carry in a couple sheets of MDF for the tables, and if you can't tell, it's a little cold outside. I think it was about 5 degrees below zero on that day. After cutting out the MDF for the bottom shelf, I quickly realized that it wasn't going to go in as one piece. So I ended up cutting it in half and it slid in just fine. Once the shelves were in place, I went ahead and just screwed them down with just some regular drywall screws. After getting the shelves installed, I went ahead and framed up the top lid or tabletop and got the hinges screwed in on the back side.
Whoa. Almost dropped it on you. Isn't that awesome?
Next, I used my angle grinder to cut some steel bars for the supports that would hold the lid open and lock it in place. Then I drilled holes on each end of each bar. One end for where the bar will pivot from, and then the other end where it will lock in place onto a round bar that has a notch in it. To cut the notch, I went ahead and took my round bar and mounted it in my drill press, and then used my angle grinder to cut the notch in the end of the round bar. After getting the bars cut and drilled, I went ahead and primed and painted them yellow. I chose yellow primarily just because it's a highly visible color, and I thought it would look good. For the round bar, I drilled a hole that was 3 inches deep, and that way it had a lot of wood to bite on, and that so that it wouldn't get pulled out easily, and I tapped that in with a hammer. For the pivot point of the support, I used a pretty good sized lag bolt with a big head on it so that I didn't have to use a washer or anything, and it seems to work really well. Next, it was time to load it up with some tools and see how it worked. And needless to say, I was very, very happy. So now that the first table's built, we still need to build a second table for the lathe and for the joiner. And I'm not going to drag you guys through that because the process is exactly the same. Some of the dimensions for the shelf spacing changed a little bit just to get the lathe up a little bit higher, but I already went ahead and built that table off camera, and here it is.
I got some chisels up here. I got the lathe mounted here, the motor underneath, the switch to turn on the lathe. 4-inch joiner over here, and you don't really need to use both of these bars to keep the lid up. So you could use a joiner like this, but this bar might get in the way a little bit. So what I do is I fold this back and just put a little piece of wood in there to kind of hold it back. The lid is still secure, and then I can add the switch up, the joiner on the other side, and I can go ahead and run boards through there.
Here's a view of the belt and the pulley. I don't have a guard on it right now. I'll probably end up building one in the future, but for now I'll just use those toolboxes to kind of keep everybody's hands and fingers out of the way. So although this table looks very similar to the first table that we built, it is much more high-tech in the sense that there are motors attached to it. And so what I did is I ended up cutting some holes in the middle shelf there so that I could mount the motors underneath that are suspended on hinges, and then the belts could feed up through the holes to the joiner and to the lathe. I also added a dust collection port to the bottom of the joiner so that I could just take my shop vac and stick the hose underneath and attach it to that port, and that works really, really well.
Metal shavings. You cut yourself on those, you got to be careful.
Hello. Thanks for watching.